Don't send me another idiot. The words didn't just land. They cracked across the dining room like a champagne glass hitting marble. Conversation stopped. Forks hovered in midair. Even the soft jazz drifting from the corner piano suddenly felt too loud. At the Sterling Room, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants, everyone knew exactly who had spoken before they even turned their heads. Richard Whitmore had arrived. The billionaire CEO sat alone at a corner table beneath a chandelier that sparkled like frozen stars. His charcoal suit looked flawless. His silver watch probably cost more than a waiter's yearly salary. But it wasn't his wealth that made people nervous. It was his reputation. Richard Whitmore was the customer every employee feared. The man who could turn a simple dinner into a nightmare. The man who once sent back a steak 3 times because the grill marks weren't symmetrical. The man who left 1-star reviews powerful enough to get managers fired. The man who treated respect like a privilege nobody else had earned. As soon as he stepped through the front doors, a silent panic spread through the staff. Servers suddenly became busy. Bartenders found reasons to disappear. Even veteran employees avoided eye contact. Nobody wanted table 12. Nobody ever wanted table 12 when Richard Whitmore was sitting there. Claire Bennett, the restaurant manager, stood near the host's stand with a forced smile and a knot tightening in her stomach. She watched employees quietly scatter like birds sensing a storm. "Who's taking him?" she asked. No one answered. A young server suddenly remembered he needed ice. Another claimed she had a large party arriving. One busboy practically vanished into the kitchen. Claire sighed. The dinner service had barely begun, and already the room felt heavier. Because tonight wasn't an ordinary night. Tonight, the Sterling Room was hosting a private gathering worth nearly $900 million. Investors, executives, and industry leaders were arriving by the minute. Deals would be discussed over aged wine and expensive seafood. Futures would be decided between courses. And sitting at the center of it all was Richard Whitmore, a man who always expected the room to bend around him. Across the restaurant, a young woman adjusted the sleeves of her uniform and watched the scene unfold with quiet curiosity. Maya Johnson had started working there only 4 days ago. 27 years old. Tall, calm, sharp-eyed. The newest waitress on staff. She didn't know all the stories yet. She hadn't spent months listening to whispered warnings in break rooms. She hadn't learned the unspoken rules everyone else seemed to follow. What she noticed instead was something simpler. A room full of adults acting afraid of one customer. Maya glanced toward table 12. Richard was already frowning as he examined the menu. A water glass sat untouched beside him. No server had approached. No one wanted to. Claire looked around desperately, searching for a volunteer that wasn't coming. Then her eyes landed on Maya. For a moment, neither woman spoke. The noise of the restaurant seemed distant. Claire hesitated. Maya offered a small, professional smile. "Need someone to take table 12?" she asked. Claire blinked. "You don't know who that is, do you?" Maya looked back toward the billionaire. Richard Whitmore folded his menu with visible irritation and glanced around the room as if everyone had already disappointed him. Maya picked up a water pitcher. "Not yet," she said quietly. "But I'm about to find out." Maya walked toward table 12 while nearly every employee in the restaurant watched her from the corners of their eyes. Some looked nervous. Others looked sorry for her. A few simply shook their heads as if they already knew how the next few minutes would end. The Sterling Room glittered around her. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm golden light across polished marble floors. The scent of grilled sea bass, fresh herbs, and expensive wine floated through the air. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan glowed beneath the evening sky. Inside, millions of dollars sat at white linen tables discussing mergers, investments, and acquisitions. Yet somehow the attention of the room seemed fixed on one thing. A new waitress carrying a water pitcher toward the most difficult customer in the city. Richard Whitmore noticed her before she reached the table. His sharp blue eyes lifted from his phone and settled on her name tag. Maya Johnson. He studied her for a second longer than necessary. Not with curiosity, with evaluation. The way some people inspected products before deciding whether they were worth their time. Maya stopped beside the table and offered a calm smile. "Good evening, sir. My name is Maya. I will be taking care of you tonight." Richard glanced at the empty water glass. Took long enough. Maya filled the glass without reacting. "I apologize for the wait." Richard leaned back slightly. Do you always apologize for problems you did not create? The question sounded less like conversation and more like a test. Maya placed the pitcher down carefully. I prefer solving problems over assigning blame. For the briefest moment, something flickered across Richard's face. Not approval. Surprise. The answer had not been what he expected. Before he could respond, a group of investors entered the private dining area across the room. Several executives stood to greet them. Handshakes began. Smiles appeared. The $900 million dinner was officially underway. Richard glanced toward the gathering and checked his watch. Impatience seemed to follow him like a shadow. Maya noticed it immediately. People often thought power looked like confidence. But confidence was usually quiet. What she saw sitting across from her looked different. Restlessness. Irritation. The constant need to control every detail. What are tonight's specials? Richard asked. Maya explained each dish clearly. Ingredients. Preparation. Recommendations. She spoke with the ease of someone who knew her work well. Halfway through her explanation, Richard interrupted. That is not what I asked. Maya paused. I am sorry. I asked for the specials. Not a speech. The words were not loud. They did not need to be. Several nearby guests still looked over. Maya remained composed. The cedar plank salmon is our most requested special tonight. Richard nodded once. See? That only took 6 words. Across the restaurant, Claire Bennett closed her eyes briefly. She had seen this pattern before. Richard always started small. Tiny comments. Tiny corrections. Tiny cuts disguised as observations. By the end of the night, most servers left his table exhausted. But Maya simply wrote down the order. Excellent choice. Richard studied her again. You are new here. Yes, sir. How long? For days. Richard took a sip of water. Interesting. Maya waited. Most people figure things out faster than that. The remark hung in the air. A lesser server might have rushed to defend themselves. Might have apologized. Might have stumbled into exactly the reaction he wanted. Instead, Maya smiled politely. Fortunately, I am a fast learner. For the first time all evening, Richard did not answer immediately. The silence lasted only a second. But in a room where everyone else seemed afraid to challenge him, even 1 second felt different. The dinner crowd continued to grow as the evening moved forward. Investors drifted between conversations. Executives exchanged practice smiles. Crystal glasses caught the golden light and scattered it across the room like tiny stars. Yet beneath the elegance, tension was quietly building. Richard Whitmore noticed it too. He always noticed shifts in a room. Power had taught him that. For years he had built an empire by reading people before they spoke. He could spot hesitation, ambition, insecurity, and fear almost instantly. Fear was usually the easiest. Most people revealed it within seconds. Maya Johnson did not. That bothered him more than he wanted to admit. 20 minutes later, she returned carrying his appetizer. Every movement was precise. Every word professional. No rushing. No nervousness. No attempt to impress him. She simply did her job. Richard watched as she placed the plate in front of him. You seem unusually calm, he said. Maya looked up. Is that a complaint, sir? A few guests at nearby tables glanced over. Richard almost smiled. Almost. Most new employees spend their first week trying not to make mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes, Maya replied. The important part is learning from them. Richard set down his fork. And what exactly did you do before serving tables? It sounded casual. It was not. Maya recognized the question immediately. People often asked it when they saw something that did not fit their expectations. She had heard it for years. In classrooms. In interviews. In boardrooms where she was the youngest person present. A little bit of everything, she answered. That is not an answer. Sometimes it is. Richard studied her face. The restaurant noise faded into the background. Around them, conversations continued, but neither seemed to notice. Claire Bennett observed from across the room and felt her pulse quicken. She had expected Richard to lose patience by now. Instead, he seemed interested. That was somehow more dangerous. Interest meant attention. Attention meant scrutiny. And Richard Whitmore had built a career dismantling people under scrutiny. In the private dining section, several investors gathered around a large presentation display. Documents were being distributed. Tablets illuminated faces. Numbers moved across screens. The $900 million deal was approaching its final discussions. Richard glanced toward the presentation area and frowned. Something about the financial summary clearly irritated him. He pulled out his phone and typed a quick message. Seconds later, one of his executives hurried across the room. The man looked anxious before he even reached the table. "Sir." Richard pointed toward a chart displayed on a nearby screen. "Why are those projections different from this morning's version?" The executive froze. "I thought the revisions were approved." "You thought?" Richard repeated quietly. The executive swallowed hard. Maya noticed the reaction immediately. Not fear of failure. Fear of Richard. The difference mattered. Richard dismissed the man with a wave and returned his attention to the documents. For the first time all evening, frustration showed openly on his face. Maya picked up the empty appetizer plate. As she did, her eyes briefly landed on the financial summary lying beside his phone. Only for a second, but a second was enough. Her expression did not change. Her pace did not slow. She continued walking toward the kitchen exactly as before. Yet something in her eyes sharpened. Because hidden among the columns of numbers was a detail that did not belong there. A detail nobody else seemed to have noticed. Back in the kitchen, Maya placed the tray onto a stainless steel counter and stood still for a moment. Around her, servers rushed between stations carrying plates and orders. The dinner rush had reached full speed. Printers buzzed. Glasses clinked. Voices overlapped. Yet her attention remained fixed on the image she had seen on Richard Whitmore's financial summary. It had only been a glance. Less than 2 seconds. But some people spent years training themselves to notice details others ignored. Maya was one of them. Years earlier, before life had taken unexpected turns, she had studied finance at Howard University. Numbers had never intimidated her. Patterns spoke a language she understood. A misplaced decimal. An unrealistic projection. A percentage that did not align with the surrounding data. Small mistakes often created very large consequences. She remembered one professor repeating the same lesson every semester. The biggest disasters rarely arrive wearing warning labels. They arrive disguised as tiny errors nobody bothers to question. Maya pushed the thought aside and returned to work. She had tables to serve and responsibilities to handle. Whatever was happening in that investment meeting was not her concern. At least that was what she told herself. Across the dining room, the atmosphere around the private investors had become noticeably more tense. Executives leaned closer to one another. Tablets exchanged hands. Several attendees reviewed printed reports with growing concentration. Richard remained at the center of it all, calm on the surface, restless underneath. He disliked uncertainty, and tonight uncertainty seemed determined to sit beside him. An hour later, Maya returned to refill coffee for several guests seated near the presentation area. As she moved between tables, fragments of conversation drifted through the air. Revenue forecasts, expansion targets, international partnerships. Most guests listened politely. Others nodded without fully understanding. Then one phrase caught her attention. Projected third-quarter growth remains at 32%. Maya slowed for half a step. 32%. That number again. The same number she had seen on the document beside Richard's phone. The same number that had immediately felt wrong. She continued pouring coffee while her mind worked quietly. A 32% growth projection was not impossible. But based on the acquisition timeline she had glimpsed, it was highly unlikely. Not unless another assumption hidden inside the model was flawed. Maya moved away before anyone noticed her attention. At table 12, Richard was growing increasingly irritated. One executive had already been corrected twice. Another had received a cold stare that ended his sentence halfway through. Nobody challenged him. Nobody ever did. Except the new waitress, apparently. As Maya passed by, Richard spoke without looking up. Coffee. It sounded less like a request and more like an expectation. Maya filled the cup. Richard scanned another report and shook his head. Unbelievable. Maya remained professional. Is everything all right, sir? Richard let out a short laugh. That depends. Do you happen to fix $900 million problems during your shift? Several nearby executives chuckled politely. The joke was aimed at her. Maya recognized that immediately. But instead of shrinking, she looked at the report resting near his hand. Then she calmly asked a question. Does the 32% projection include the revised distribution costs? The silence that followed felt almost physical. Richard slowly lifted his eyes. The executives stopped smiling. Even the nearest investor looked up from his tablet. Nobody spoke. Because for the first time that evening, the waitress was no longer part of the background. She had just stepped directly into the conversation. The silence stretched across the private dining room like a tightening wire. One question from a waitress had accomplished what millions of dollars, executive titles, and polished presentations could not. It had stopped everyone. Richard Whitmore stared at Maya Johnson without blinking. The confidence that usually filled the room seemed to pause, searching for its footing. Around the table, executives exchanged uncertain glances. Investors looked from Maya to the financial reports and back again. Nobody knew what to say first. Richard finally leaned back in his chair. "What did you just ask?" His voice remained calm, but there was something new beneath it. Curiosity. Maya kept her posture professional. "I asked whether the 32% projection includes the revised distribution costs." One executive frowned immediately. Another lowered his eyes toward the report. Across the table, a gray-haired investor named Edward Hayes adjusted his glasses and turned a page. "What revised distribution costs?" he asked. The room shifted. Small movements. Quick glances. The kind people make when they suddenly realize they may have missed something important. Richard's chief financial officer cleared his throat. The revised costs were not included in the final growth estimate because they were expected to be offset during quarter 4. Maya remained silent. She had not intended to become part of the meeting, but now everyone was looking at her. Edward Hayes studied the report more carefully. "Expected," he repeated. "Expected is not the same thing as verified." Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. He looked back at Maya. "You seem unusually interested in financial projections for someone working a dinner shift." Several executives smirked. The familiar pattern was returning. The subtle attempt to push her back into the role he believed she belonged in. Yet Maya did not react. "I am interested in numbers," she answered simply. Edward glanced up again. "And do you believe the projection is incorrect?" Every head turned toward her. The restaurant noise faded into the distance. Even guests at nearby tables seemed aware that something unusual was happening. Maya considered her words carefully. "I believe the projection may rely on assumptions that deserve another review." Nobody laughed. Nobody rolled their eyes. The reason was simple. She sounded confident. Not arrogant. Not emotional. Certain. Richard folded his hands together. "And what exactly qualifies you to make that assessment?" The question carried weight. It was designed to expose weakness, to remind everyone of hierarchy. Maya met his gaze. "Before I became a waitress, I completed a finance degree and worked in risk analysis for 2 years. The reaction was immediate. One executive blinked in surprise. Another lowered his coffee cup halfway to the table. Claire Bennett, watching from across the room, nearly dropped the folder in her hands. Richard said nothing. Maya continued. "I left that career after my mother became ill. Family needed me more than a corporate office did. No dramatic speech. No self-pity. Just facts." Edward Hayes slowly nodded. "Then perhaps we should hear what she noticed." For the first time that night, the balance of attention shifted. Not completely. Not yet. But enough for everyone to feel it. Richard Whitmore had spent years being the smartest voice in every room he entered. Tonight, for the first time in a very long time, another voice was beginning to compete for the room's attention. The room remained still as Edward Hayes slid the report across the table toward Maya. Nobody invited waitresses into $900 million discussions. Nobody asked servers to review investment projections. Yet somehow that was exactly what was happening. Maya glanced toward Claire Bennett across the restaurant. The manager looked completely frozen. Maya understood why. One wrong sentence could end the evening badly. One right sentence could change everything. She took a slow breath. "The growth projection assumes distribution costs stabilize within 90 days, she said calmly. "But according to the acquisition timeline, the integration period alone lasts 120 days. Several executives immediately lowered their eyes to the report. Fingers turned pages. Calculators appeared on tablet screens. Maya continued. "That means your projected savings arrive before the merger infrastructure is fully operational." Edward Hayes leaned forward. Meaning the model is counting benefits before they realistically exist." The silence returned. This time it felt heavier. Richard Whitmore stared at the numbers. His expression remained controlled, but something behind his eyes had shifted. He was listening now, not because he wanted to, because he had to. One executive cleared his throat. The assumption was based on an accelerated rollout strategy. Maya nodded politely. "Then the forecast should identify it as an aggressive scenario, not a baseline projection." Nobody answered immediately, Because she was right. Edward slowly removed his glasses. How much difference does that make? Maya considered the figures. Potentially enough to change investor expectations by tens of millions during the first year. Around the table, several people exchanged concerned looks. The restaurant suddenly seemed quieter than before. Conversations from nearby tables faded into distant background noise. The center of attention was no longer the billionaire. It was the woman standing beside him. Richard folded his hands. You reached that conclusion from a brief glance. Maya met his gaze. Patterns are easier to recognize when you spend years studying them. Richard looked at her for several seconds. Then something unexpected happened. He opened the report again and began reviewing the pages himself. Not dismissively, carefully. The executives watched in silence. They knew Richard better than anyone. He hated being corrected. He hated surprises even more. 5 minutes passed. Nobody spoke. Finally, Richard turned a page and stopped. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. There it was. A supporting assumption buried deep inside the financial appendix. The distribution adjustment had been categorized differently than the rest of the integration expenses. Technically disclosed. Practically invisible. The room felt different now. Not hostile. Not comfortable. Honest. Edward Hayes slowly smiled. Well, he said, leaning back in his chair. That is the first truly useful thing I have heard all evening. A few investors laughed softly. Not at Maya. At the absurdity of the situation. An entire room full of highly paid professionals had overlooked something a waitress noticed in seconds. Richard closed the report. For the first time since arriving, he did not look irritated. He looked thoughtful. Across the restaurant, employees who had spent years avoiding table 12 watched in disbelief. The man nobody challenged was being forced to reconsider. Not by a rival executive. Not by a competing billionaire. By the newest waitress in the building. And deep down, everyone sensed the same thing. The evening was no longer following the script Richard Whitmore expected. For several long seconds, nobody moved. Nobody reached for a glass. Nobody checked a phone. The private dining room had become something rare in the world of power and money. Honest. Edward Hayes rested both hands on the table and looked directly at Richard Whitmore. How many people reviewed these projections before tonight? The question landed softly, but its weight was impossible to ignore. One executive shifted in his seat. Another adjusted his tie. Richard answered without looking away from the report. 7. Edward nodded slowly. 7 highly compensated professionals. No one responded. Maya stood quietly beside the table, wishing more than anything to return to serving dinner. She had never intended to become part of the evening. Yet the evening seemed unwilling to let her leave. Richard closed the folder and finally looked up. You said you worked in risk analysis. Yes, sir. What company? Maya hesitated for only a moment. Caldwell Strategic Advisors. Several executives immediately recognized the name. It was one of the most respected consulting firms in the country. Richard noticed their reactions. Why leave? Maya glanced toward the dining room. Because life happens. Richard waited. Maya continued. My mother was diagnosed with a chronic illness. She needed help. Family became more important than quarterly earnings reports. The answer carried no bitterness. No resentment. Just truth. Somehow that made it more powerful. Edward leaned back and smiled faintly. That explains the numbers. Richard studied her carefully. Throughout the evening, he had searched for insecurity, hesitation, or weakness. Instead, he kept finding competence. Calm competence. The kind that does not need attention because it already knows its value. Across the restaurant, staff members continued pretending not to watch. But they watched anyway. Luis Carter, one of the senior servers, had worked there for 8 years. He had seen politicians, celebrities, athletes, and billionaires come through those doors. He had never seen anyone challenge Richard Whitmore without being immediately dismissed. Yet Maya had done it repeatedly, and somehow she had earned the respect of the very people Richard wanted to impress. Edward turned another page in the report. If this assumption had remained unnoticed, what would happen? Maya answered carefully. The deal would probably still move forward, but future performance would struggle to match expectations. Investors would eventually ask questions. Edward nodded. And markets dislike surprises. Very much. A quiet laugh moved around the table. Not nervous this time. Genuine. Richard rested his elbows on the table. You realize you may have saved us from a significant problem. Maya offered a small smile. I simply pointed at something worth reviewing. Most people would not have noticed it. Most people were busy doing other jobs. Richard almost smiled again. This time the expression stayed a little longer. The atmosphere around the table began to change. Not because money had changed hands. Not because a deal had been signed. Because perspective had shifted. For years, Richard had walked into rooms assuming he already knew where value existed. Tonight, value had arrived carrying a water pitcher. And for the first time, he was beginning to understand how much that assumption had cost him. The evening moved forward, but nothing felt the same. The investors remained at the table long after the scheduled presentation had ended. Reports were reopened. Assumptions were questioned. Numbers that had been accepted without discussion an hour earlier were now being examined line by line. It was remarkable what happened when people stopped assuming the smartest person in the room had already found every answer. Edward Hayes appeared energized. The veteran investor asked more questions than anyone else. Some were directed at Richard. Some at his executives. More than a few were directed at Maya. Each answer she gave was careful and measured. She never exaggerated. She never tried to impress anyone. She simply spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who understood her subject. Ironically, that made her words carry even more weight. Around the restaurant, the story was already spreading. Servers whispered near service stations. Bartenders exchanged looks. Employees who normally avoided table 12 now found excuses to walk past it. Nobody could believe what they were seeing. Richard Whitmore was listening. Not interrupting. Not correcting. Listening. The difference was impossible to miss. Near the end of the meeting, Edward closed the final report and rested both hands on the table. I think we need another review before moving forward, he said. Several investors immediately agreed. Heads nodded around the room. Richard remained silent for a moment. Months earlier, such a recommendation might have irritated him. Tonight it did not. Because deep down he knew something uncomfortable. The review was necessary. And if Maya had remained silent, nobody would have suggested it. One executive finally spoke. Delaying the final approval could cost us several weeks. Edward looked directly at him. Approving a flawed assumption could cost far more. Nobody argued. The decision was made. The deal was not canceled. It was paused, reevaluated, strengthened, protected from a mistake that might have grown much larger over time. As the investors slowly stood and prepared to leave, Edward turned toward Maya. Do you know how many consultants charge thousands of dollars to do what you did tonight? Maya smiled politely. I was only doing my job. Edward laughed softly. No, you were doing much more than that. Richard watched the exchange quietly. The words struck harder than he expected. All evening he had evaluated Maya through the lens he used on everyone else. Position, status, title. Yet every important contribution of the night had come from the person with the lowest title in the room. The realization sat heavily on him. Eventually the investors departed. Handshakes were exchanged. Business cards changed hands. The private dining room slowly emptied. The noise of the restaurant returned. Dishes clinked. Conversations resumed. Manhattan glittered beyond the windows. Normal life seemed to return. Yet for Richard Whitmore, nothing felt entirely normal anymore. As Maya gathered empty glasses from the table, he looked at her differently than he had when the night began. Not as a waitress. Not as an employee. Not as background. For the first time, he saw what everyone else had overlooked. Value does not always arrive wearing a tailored suit. Sometimes it arrives carrying a tray and quietly changes the direction of an entire room. The restaurant finally began to empty. Chairs slid quietly across polished floors. The last investors disappeared into waiting town cars beneath the glow of Manhattan streetlights. Inside the Sterling room, employees started closing routines they had performed hundreds of times before. Yet nobody could stop talking about what had happened. Maya Johnson returned to her work as if the evening had been completely ordinary. She cleared tables, stacked menus, refilled stations, the same tasks she had been doing since the beginning of her shift. That alone surprised people. Most individuals would have spent the rest of the night talking about themselves. Maya did not. She simply worked. Nearly an hour later, Richard Whitmore remained seated at table 12. The reports were gone. The investors were gone. The pressure of the deal had faded into the night. Yet he had not left. He sat quietly staring through the windows at the city below. For perhaps the first time in years, he was thinking about something other than winning. Maya approached with the final check folder. Good evening, sir. We are preparing to close. Richard looked up. The sharp edge that had defined his voice earlier seemed absent. Long night? Maya asked politely. Richard let out a quiet laugh. Long lesson? Maya did not respond. She simply waited. Richard looked around the nearly empty dining room. Do you know something strange? Maya tilted her head slightly. What is that? Everyone in this building seemed afraid of me when I walked in. Maya remained silent. Richard smiled faintly. You were not. The answer came without hesitation. I was not afraid of you, sir. I just did not see a reason to fear another human being. The words landed gently. That made them impossible to ignore. Richard looked down for a moment. Throughout his career, people had respected him, admired him, envied him, and feared him. Yet very few had spoken to him with simple honesty. You know, he said slowly, I spent years believing that the smartest person in the room should always be the loudest. Maya smiled. Tonight proved otherwise. Richard nodded. Yes, it did. He stood from the table and reached into his jacket pocket. Maya expected a credit card,